Cheers. Yes, so we can talk about Europe in crisis, alternatives to austerity. We'll start off with James Meadway, who is, most of you may know, senior economist at the New Economics Foundation, speaking his own personal capacity, of course. To give us a background to the crisis, and then we'll have Lindsay German, socialist author and activist, talking about alternatives to austerity and how it can be resisted. So, James will speak for about 10-15 minutes.
Yeah, sure. Okay, well, I'm sorry I'm late. I was tied up with a bit of a situation at SOAS with people occupying buildings and all sorts of other stuff going on down there, so that's why I'm late, so I'm sorry about that. I wanted to start with, the first thing has been the news all this week, which is that this is, and it started off in the FT last week actually, with headlines about 10 days to save the Eurozone, and then it was 5 days, and it's 4 days, and at the moment it looks like about 2 days, because of course there's this grand meeting of the various Euro ministers on Friday, where the plan is to finally, solve all of Europe's various economic problems, cobble out a deal, and therefore we can all live happily ever after, more or less. Now, there are a number of sort of flaws with this thing. I think what we're actually looking at is a continuation of what's been happening for the last nearly 2 years now, actually, around about 2 years, which is a succession of essentially worsening crises inside Europe and inside the Eurozone in particular, connected to the problem of sovereign debt, of debt held by nations and by states inside the Eurozone, and then with the potential of spreading elsewhere. And what you've gone through over that year is a series of attempts by the various different European nations, members of the Eurozone, to try and come up with a solution each time the debt crisis reasserts itself. I'll get on to in a second why they think the debt crisis is so bad, because it's perhaps not quite the reason you're often given for it, but I'll move on to that in a bit. And every single time what you've got is another emergency summit where the heads of state all gather, or sometimes the finance ministers all gather, they thrash out an agreement, there's wild jubilation on the bond markets for what started off probably about a month or so, and is now, as of the last deal that was sort of thrashed out at the end of October, lasted about 3-4 days before everyone realised that this one wasn't going to work either. The terms of the latest deal involve a number of things, none of which look particularly promising, none of which are going to resolve the crisis, and all of which point towards the one kind of underlying theme in all of this, the one solution that, for all the squabbling and bickering about who's going to be responsible for clearing up this mess, the one thing that everybody, all the European leaders have agreed on, aided and abetted by the European Central Bank and the IMF, who have sort of sat behind much of this, is that it is always going to be the rest of European society, in particular European workers, who pay for this, and it is not going to be the richest in European societies. Even the suggestion that perhaps a tiny tax on the kind of speculation that takes place with the big banks in the financial system, the financial transactions tax, even that has provoked enormous controversy, and you are talking about a very, very small levy on the kind of gambling and speculation that financial institutions involve in. Of course, it's been Britain, or at least the British government at this point, led by David Cameron and George Osborne, who have been most vociferous about not imposing any additional taxes on the financial system. So all throughout this, the underlying theme for whatever sort of madcap plans have been hatched at the sort of top end of things, have been all throughout this has been an attempt to say we will have austerity everywhere, we will cut funding for public services everywhere, we will ramp up taxes for ordinary people everywhere we can get away with it, and we will, as far as possible, push the costs of the debt crisis, the costs of trying to repay this debt, onto workers and their allies inside Europe, onto the rest of European society, and away from the people who are principally responsible for it, and I'll get onto this, which is the people who own the banks, the people in the financial system, the top 1%. By the way, the top 1% in this country, half of them work in financial services. These are very, very well rewarded people, and they are the people, if you're going to point the finger of blame anywhere, they are the people to whom you should point the blame for this crisis this time round. So that's been austerity. The principal problem with introducing austerity, with saying you're going to cut spending as fast as possible because there's all this debt that's built up and we have to get rid of it as fast as possible. The principal problem of it is something that's been known about for really since the 1930s. And Keynes, John Maynard Keynes, who was a great sort of bourgeois economist, really kind of theorised this and popularised the theory of it in the 1930s in response to the Great Depression, when governments acted much as they are doing now, which was say, oh, we're in a recession, there's big debt everywhere, we need to cut spending rapidly to try and get ourselves out of it. He pointed out the actually fairly obvious conclusion that if you're in a recession, if you're in an economy that is weak, that is not growing, that people aren't spending money, and if you look at Britain, if you look across Europe, people aren't spending money, businesses aren't investing, nobody's buying exports, or at least it's looking very, very ropey. If that's the case, then to reduce government spending makes the recession worse. It pushes down on demand inside an economy, and therefore you extend the recession. That makes the whole thing substantially worse. So the point with austerity is that although what you're told is that it is necessary to cut public spending everywhere, and if you look, by the way, at the kind of measures that are being enacted, I mean, Greece is sort of ground zero for this, really shocking stuff, like talking about sacking a third of the government workforce, increases in the mandatory pension age by 15 years, trying to make people pay their taxes through electricity bills, so they can't possibly ever hope to avoid it, that if you don't pay your electricity bill you get your electricity cut off, and therefore you have to pay the tax there. I mean, really quite a dramatic attack on Greek society and on actually the poorest in Greek society in particular. That's the net effect of austerity. That's the kind of social impact of it. The economic impact of it is that absolutely everywhere this is being attempted, it is producing stagnation. So in Greece, which is then mired in a very, very deep recession, the economy is shrinking by around about 7% a year. In Ireland, similar impact. In Portugal, it's the same thing. And of course, outside the Eurozone, in this country, something similar is happening. We also have a government that is trying to cut as fast as possible and therefore driving the economy back into recession. Of course, the net effect of this is that you will not be able to repay the debt that you're so desperately worried about, because if there's no economic growth, it means you're not getting the tax receipts in. It means you're not therefore being able to pay off the debt that you're desperately trying to get rid of over the other side. And take Greece. At the start of the year it had a debt to GDP, a debt to the size of its economy ratio of something around 110, 120%, which is pretty big. By the end of this year it's on 190%, and that's after the austerity measures have been introduced. So the debt is accelerating away because the economy is in such a weak state. The size of the debt relative to the size of the economy is growing enormously, and it's austerity that's the principal reason for introducing that. So why are they doing it? I think it starts to look like this, because you can sort of come with lots of different, there's kind of slightly spurious academic disputes about it, but I think there's a principal terror that's gripping the European ruling classes at the moment that really turns this crisis from being something that's just about debt and therefore just about public spending into being something much more serious, which is that if you look at Europe and if you look at where this sovereign debt is held, where these national debts are held, it's held inside European banks. If you take out a debt, you owe someone else money. So if a government borrows money, they owe that money somewhere else. So in the case of Greece, for instance, it borrowed a lot of money, it turns out, from French and German banks. So that means French and German banks hold the other side of this debt. And what's motivating, I think, a real panic, and which indicates the depth of the crisis that we're now in inside the Eurozone and spreading wider than that, is that this debt is not just a problem for national governments, it is therefore also a problem for the banking system. Because if there's a risk that Greece, for example, and it's the most likely candidate still to not be able to repay its debts, if there's a risk that it will default, if there's a risk that it won't pay its debt, that means the bank takes a hit. And that's just Greece. And Greece is, the 35th largest economy in the world. It's not, it's big and it would have some impact, but it's not absolutely cataclysmic. Italy is now being lined up as a candidate for defaulting on its debt because it does have a very large national debt, and that debt is held to a very large extent actually inside French banks. And if Italy defaults, it's the 8th largest economy on the planet. It has an absolutely colossal national debt of something over, I think it's around 1.3 trillion euros. Big old chunk of that is held inside the European banking system. Therefore, Italy defaults, wipes out the European banking system. You get a major financial crisis. You get this kind of immediate knock-on effect. Now, this is when you get into the second round of it, and this is why, incidentally, Standard & Poor's, which is one of the big credit rating agencies that's supposed to assess countries and companies to see how likely they are to default, has decided that 15 out of the 17 Eurozone members are all now on what they're calling a negative watch. They're all at risk of having their credit rating downgraded because Standard & Poor's thinks there's an increased risk that they will default on their national debt. Go into the reasons why they think this. There's a number of them, but the one that's really striking, and I think it's the one that's most important for the immediate crisis, is that they have large banking systems. Those large banking systems are themselves massively exposed to debt elsewhere, and if a debt failure happens in Greece or Italy or somewhere else in Europe, those banking systems take a hit. Those banking systems will then demand bailouts just as they did in 2008, and so the whole crisis is pushed back on to the public balance sheet. In other words, there'll be another acceleration of public debt. Now, of course, that debt is then going to feed back into the rest of the system. What you've got here is a kind of vicious circle. You've got a process in which there's no obvious conclusion to it. There's no real reason to expect a break at any point between the crisis of public debt here going into a crisis of private finance because it feeds back into the financial system, with then a further risk coming back into the public financial system once countries start trying to offer bailouts to the banks. And of course you have to go another step back to this. The reason those debts have increased everywhere, the reason deficits have gone up everywhere, the reason we're looking at another an extended recession, the thing that actually got the ball rolling here was the financial crisis. It was a series of essentially bad bets taken by the global financial system over the 2000s, bets on ridiculous things like subprime mortgages, which then turned very bad, started to default. These are mortgages offered to often desperately poor people with no real prospects of repaying them in America, which then started to default, which then rippled throughout the rest of the financial system, a financial system which at the time had worked out wonderful new ways to mix up debt and invent new financial products and trade the debt amongst themselves, and that therefore only, at least when the good times ended, only accelerated the impact of those defaults that wiped out that financial system, or threatened to do so, going through 2007, 2008, and provoked governments into the bailouts and into the attempts to prop up economy through the massive rise in deficits. So that's why you have the situation now. That was a crisis of the private financial system. It has been turned into a crisis of the public financial system. There is now a substantial threat that it turns back into a crisis of the private financial system and then feeds back onto the public finances. This is not, to put it bluntly, a very good place to end up. If you then throw into this the desperate attempt by governments across Europe to try and drive through austerity as a way to break this cycle, because they think, I think this is roughly it, they think that by clearing out public spending here, they can kind of shore up their own balances. For now, they can hold off the markets and they can potentially deal with any future crises in a rather more robust fashion because they think they've got rid of the debt. The desperate attempt to do that now is merely undermining the conditions by which you might ever recover as an economy, you might ever dig yourself out of this complete mess at the moment. So that's the situation as it stands. I think it's fair to say a couple of things. The first is that there are absolutely no realistic prospects of recovery inside Europe or inside the Eurozone at this point in time, going over the next however many years you want to talk about. There's a belief and there's a myth that capitalism corrects itself after a while because of the wonders of the market. Prices drop, people are unemployed, and then after a while prices drop so much, everything's really cheap, so the economy picks up again, the market just corrects itself. It doesn't have to do that, and it isn't doing that. That's one part of it. The second part of it is that Europe has a chronically dysfunctional financial system, married, by the way, to a dysfunctional single currency, but it's a chronically dysfunctional financial system, and that is another barrier to any kind of recovery. It's also likely that it'll tip over at some point into another financial crash. The chances of this happening have to be reckoned pretty high. And it's not just like the crazy lefties saying this, Standard & Poor's are saying this, major credit rating agencies are saying this. The chances of another financial crash inside of Europe, and therefore spreading everywhere else, are pretty high at this point in time. And the final bit is that austerity everywhere means that you tear apart societies after a while, you trash welfare states, you get rid of actually the gains that have been made inside Europe over the last 50 years or so since the end of the war. You get rid of that, and at the same time, because people object, you start to get rid of democracy. You start to say, well, actually, you won't have a referendum in Greece and any of this stuff. We're just going to appoint a new prime minister it's coincidentally a banker, of course. We're going to appoint a new prime minister in Italy, who's also going to be finance minister, which is nice, but not yet Il Duce, who is also, by the way, a banker. And then, we're going to have a European Central Bank, which, of course, no one has ever elected overseeing all of this. You roll back in democracy because you know that austerity is not popular with the people that it's being forced upon. And that, I think, is the situation as it now stands. It's fair to say it's bleak, but there are moments, I think, of hope out of all this. I think you see the strikes last week, you look at the Occupy movement, you see the response that's starting to develop. The question, I think, is what kind of alternatives can we pose to this, and how do we organise to try and resist some of the worst effects of it? And all that, I'll finish.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. I'd like to introduce Lindsay, who's going to be talking about, picking up where James left, about alternatives to austerity in light of the context and in light of recent events with the strikes as well.
Okay, thanks Dan, and thanks everybody for coming. I mean, as Dan says, I want to really start where James ended, which is that you've got this picture of Europe, and obviously this doesn't just apply to Europe, but you've got a particular crisis in Europe at the moment, which is about the ability of the system to deliver in its own terms, not in our terms, but in its own terms. I mean, they're not particularly interested about delivering in our terms as long as they can get away with it. But they're finding a crisis of profitability, they're finding a crisis of their banking system, their whole financial system, and they're finding that the debt which they encouraged for so many years and which they've used for so many years is now rebounding on them. They encouraged working people, particularly in the poorer countries, but also in the countries, the richer countries like Britain and America, which have low wages. They encourage people to borrow, because how else do you bridge the gap between what you're earning and what you're told that you should be spending? You know, you look at the advertising, you look at the things that people think that they need and maybe really do need, and of course then there are the things that they do actually need, like food and housing and all that kind of thing. How do people pay for these things? They pay for it in Britain, America, and increasingly in Southern Europe, in Spain and Greece and so on, by borrowing to supplement their wages. They're told that this will all be a fantastic sort of future, they can go on doing this forever, they want to borrow to, you know, improve their house, and they want to borrow to go on holiday or buy a car. It's all going to get better and better because property values will go up, and of course they've been told that they had to buy a house in order to maximise the benefits of the housing market. And of course many people had no choice but to buy a house, because there weren't the council houses being built. In fact, they were being sold off and all that kind of thing. So they're told they had to do this. They did do it. Maybe people in this room probably most of us have got some debt or another, and maybe some of us have got very substantial debt. This was all encouraged. It was all done on the basis of this kept people relatively happy and allowed them to believe that their living standards were increasing, whereas actually the reality was something very, very different, that they will now have to work for many, many years, and George Osborne has told us this. We will now have to work for many, many years with our living standards getting worse and worse and worse, just to pay off this debt and to deal with the austerity which the government tells us that they have. The governments as well, of course, have been borrowing. I mean, they have this now, you know, their phrase that we all maxed out on our credit cards. Well, of course, they're not having to pay back the credit cards at high interest rates, but they have been borrowing as well. One of the things they've been borrowing for is wars and weapons and all these kind of things. The deficit which they now tell us that they want us to pay back is at least in part caused by the estimated $3 trillion that the Americans have spent on Iraq and Afghanistan, or will have spent by the time they've finished. In Britain, you are talking about billions and billions of pounds every year going on these wars. That's just one aspect of what they've been borrowing for. They've been borrowing for all sorts of other reasons as well. Now they're telling us the music has stopped and that we've all got to make sacrifices. There's a few things wrong with that kind of theory. One is that actually for a number of people, not just 1% actually, for a rather bigger number of people in this country, they don't have to make sacrifices. If you look at the housing market in London, the housing market is absolutely stagnant until you get to the plus 1 million cost of housing. And that is a booming market. It's an absolutely booming market, not just the rich Russians and the oligarchs and all these other people who are repressing their own people on the streets of Moscow and St. Petersburg, but actually all sorts of people who work in the City of London, all these different sorts of people are quite able to spend 2, 3, 4, 5 and upwards £1 million on a house or a flat. These are the things that you now find are absolutely commonplace at the top end of the market. If you look at the salaries and the bonuses and all these things, it seems to me that the people in society who are really protected in this society are the bankers. It seems that they can do absolutely no wrong, and that the idea they shouldn't have bonuses is whispered, but really it's absolutely, they say, oh, people are frightened of upsetting the pensioners by taking their bus passes away, but actually the people they're really frightened of is the bankers taking their bonuses away, because they really cannot dare do this. David Cameron said only this week that he will stand up for Britain, and if Europe does anything to damage the City of London, this will be his line in the sand. He won't allow this to happen. And this is because he claims that the City of London pays £50 billion a year in tax. Now, James is the economist here and no doubt can give us whether that is a true figure or not, but I know they think the rest of us don't pay tax all the time. We are paying billions and billions of pounds in tax all the time, every time we buy things, every time we go to work, every time we do any of these sorts of things. But this idea that some people are absolutely protected and the rest aren't is one of the more grotesque and hideous sides of the society in which we now live. I mean, I was born at a time when actually people's living standards were going up, when the welfare state was being developed, and where people regarded the post-war settlement in this country as something which was a kind of a payback for the suffering that people had during the Second World War. And this was something people felt right around Europe, and people suffered much worse than people in Britain in countries like Italy or France or Yugoslavia, where you had again, people seriously wanted change, where they had occupation by the Nazis. They seriously wanted change, and this was the world in which the European Union developed. This was the world in which people thought, well, we don't want war again. We want peace. We want prosperity. What have they brought us? They've brought us a bureaucratic, smug, kind of hideous amalgam of different countries, where you've been told you have to accept everything that's good for you, the euro's good for you, all these other things are good for you, and actually when they come to a crisis like they're now coming to, we have to accept even more. As James has said, they're actually saying you can't have democracy anymore in Europe because democracy is too expensive, because what the hell are people going to vote for? Well, we know that everybody who gets the chance to vote for a government kicks out their old government. And that's what they're frightened of in Greece, that's what they're frightened of in Italy. They don't want a situation where the budgets that these governments are imposing, which means real cuts in living standards in Ireland, in Greece, in Spain, in all these places, in Italy, that they will not allow people to do that. And that's why if you look at the Italian government isn't just bankers, it's also a former European commissioner and an admiral who is the Minister of Defence, who used to work for NATO. He may still work for NATO, for all I know. But this is the kind of thing that they're doing. So they're attacking democracy. If you try to protest, you are met with more and more police repression. This is happening in every single country, and we know very well it's happening here in London, that the Occupy movement has seen a lot of attacks on it. There is now a law going through Westminster where they will stop any camps, not just outside Parliament, but throughout the whole Westminster Abbey, all the other buildings that they don't want any of the dirty, unwashed and common people being anywhere near. I mean, this is the kind of thing. Now, you can go on this all the time. They're attacking working people. What is it we're going to do about it? Well, there are two alternatives here. We can either accept what they're asking us to accept, which will mean not just lower living standards for people, it will mean an increase in poverty, very serious increase in poverty. It will probably mean an lowering of the life expectancy in this country, which will no doubt delight them, that people, they're very worried that people are living longer and that costs so much in pensions. Well, they can deal with that. It will lead to a worsening of health, because poverty and unemployment leads to a worsening of physical and mental health as a result of things. In America, in the Great Depression in the 1930s, people stopped having children, and that will happen as well. That people, when they're unemployed, despite the the Daily Mail rumours that everybody has dozens of children when they're unemployed, actually the opposite. The people avoid, insofar as they can, having children because they don't have the money to pay for it. You are talking about a society which will be seriously affected by it. And of course, you will have the riots that we saw in this summer, where people will say, well, the only way that we can grab something is by going out in the streets and doing all the things that people did. So we can either have that, or we can organise to fight back. And it seems to me, for people like ourselves, that is the only alternative. We are facing a very, very serious choice now for humanity around the world, and this is what the economic crisis is really pointing out. Do we want a world of equality and justice and so on, in which case we have to take the power from the people who at the moment control the wealth in society, because they've led us to this situation, they've created this situation, and they will do everything they can to hang on to their wealth and power at whatever cost. Oh, absolutely, whatever cost. There's no possibility that will change. So, in my opinion, we have to organise and we have to fight back. Now, the problem with this is that we have now, in this country and in most other countries around the world, we have now had decades. Sorry, I've only got a couple more minutes. Yeah. Okay. We've now had decades where unions have been weakened, where the left has been in crisis, and where the working class has not had a voice in many places. In my view, the working class isn't just a traditional view of, the men in boiler suits or dungarees or that kind of thing, the sort of image of that you have it. But actually is, of course, the vast majority of people who produce the wealth in this society, and the pensioners, and the people and the unemployed, and all these other sorts of people. These people have lost a lot of their voice, and one of the things that we have to do is to try to regain that voice. That's what November the 30th was about, and it was very, very important. It was very important. Something like 2 million people went on strike, which is very, very sizable number of people, the biggest strike for a number of years. It's also, in my opinion, just as important that very large numbers of people demonstrated on that day. I mean, I think if you add up the demonstrations, I don't know, 300,000 or 400,000 people around the country demonstrated, which on a weekday is a very large number of people to demonstrate, and makes it comparable with the demonstration in March organised by the TUC, which was a weekend. And that tells you that people, politically, there is a minority of people who don't want to put up with this anymore, who do want an end to austerity, who do want more equality, who do want justice, who don't want racism, who don't want any of this kind of thing. How do we actually try to organise those people and really and build a movement out of it? Well, the first thing is that I think we have to understand that we have to unite the movement as broadly as possible. It seems to me one of the problems with the left in this country is the divisions and the sectarianism over a whole number of different things, and how how people actually operate, and that is a big problem, and that's something that you don't overcome overnight, because there are real political reasons why people are divided. But then you have to say, what can we unite around? Can we unite against the Kurds? Can we unite over the war? Is there going to be another attack on Iran? In my opinion, there will be, and therefore we have to unite around all these issues. Can you unite around these things? And in practice, people will see who is right and who is wrong about the political questions. The second thing, which I think is very important, is I don't believe you can build a movement just out of what I would call syndicalism. In other words, narrow sectional trade union struggle. And one of my criticisms of the trade union movement, which contains many, many good people, I'm a member of 2 unions myself, and I was out on the picket lines on Wednesday, so it isn't a criticism of the unions as such. We cannot just fight this as about pensions. We cannot just fight it as about a little bit more wages. This is a huge attack from the ruling class on the whole of the working class and on the whole of the poor, and unless we fight it politically, unless we understand the connection between trade union struggle, political struggle and ideological struggle, we will get absolutely nowhere. And that, just to conclude, leads me to the fact that we need organisation. This is what Counterfire is trying to build. We're a small organisation, but we think that actually our analysis that we put forward in our publications on the website is actually an analysis which has a realistic understanding of what is going on, but also a view of how you can change the world. And I think we're pretty unique on the left in terms of being able to do this. We also do understand the left cannot just be the reenactment society. You know, we're not people who go out and dress up as roundheads and cavaliers and, you know, fight the same old battles we've been doing for the last 40 years. So actually the left has to say what has happened in the last 40 years, what's changed, what's stayed the same. The fundamental nature of exploitation is still the same, but actually the way in which people organise, the way in which people work, the way in which they do all these things have changed. And therefore, any left worth its salt has to be able to relate particularly to young people, particularly to the struggles that are going on, but also to understand we don't have all the answers, and that one of the things that Lenin, who I'm a great admirer of, is Russian revolutionary, who has bad press these days, but who I think was very, very important in transforming Russian society. He quoted from a man called Goethe, who was a German poet, when he said, grey is theory, but green is the tree of life. And it seems to me one of the most exciting things about this year, with the Middle East revolutions and all the other things that have been going on, is that life is teaching us, and we have to use our socialist ideas and our socialist theory in order to understand how, out of those real living experiences of people, we can build a new left-wing movement which can really challenge the power of the rich and the wealthy and the exploiters. So,
thank you, James Lindsay. Open up to.
Okay, well look, I mean, obviously I'll leave some of the questions for James. I mean, and obviously some were asked directly to him, but I mean, I just wanted to make a few points really. I mean, the question of British social attitudes, which Charlie raised, I don't know if people saw or heard the reports on it. And I mean, to be honest, it strikes me that firstly, there's all sorts of different things people take out of these things. I mean, it's a long book. I don't know if people have ever seen it, but it is a book that comes out every year that surveys people on different things. I think it's become more of a suspect survey than it used to be, but it usually has some very interesting things in it as well. But if you listen to the BBC this morning, it's very interesting. They go on about it. It shows that everyone's more selfish, is basically, you know, the conclusion which the BBC obviously believes, that none of us will give up our cars or our, you know, all the things they always say. Actually, when you read The Guardian, it focuses on the difference between people who are privately educated and state educated, and shows that the privately educated are, as you'd expect, you know, sort of complete bastards compared to most people who go to state schools, to paraphrase it. But in other words, you get a totally different picture of what it's about. Now, my view is that when you do those sort of surveys, you are, in a society like ours, you're going to get very contradictory things. I mean, for example, they say, oh, older people are much more liberal than younger people. This is one of the things the BBC said. Now, that just simply is not true. If you look at most ways in which you judge people in terms of people's attitude to general political questions, in terms of their attitude towards law and order, for example, older people are much more right-wing, and older people are much more racist by and large still, you know, and much more conservative with a small c in terms of their attitude to social change. So, God knows, but I mean, I do think that what happens is when you have year after year of things like, you know, Alan Sugar and The Bloody Apprentice and you know, competitive programmes on television are out of this world. I mean, you can't watch a cooking programme without it being somebody having to do it against the clock, compete with somebody else, get told they're going to have to go out through the door there because their meringue failed to rise sufficiently. You know, I mean, and that is, you know, that is a kind of way that capitalism operates, to make people think they always have to strive to be better than somebody else. You can't cooperate. I mean, what the hell is the point of people all separately doing all these things, you know? And so I'm not surprised that's reflected in some of the attitudes, and I think it shows what a contested society we live in, really. And I think all the things we've been talking about shows how contested it is. I mean, if you look at the question of the right and the left. I mean, the truth is, there must be probably 1 million people in this country who would regard themselves as quite left-wing. I'm not talking about necessarily revolutionary socialists, but people who regard themselves left of Labour or very left-wing Labour and to the left of that. That's quite a lot of people out of 60 million people. And as we were saying, the number of people on the demonstrations, that's quite big numbers of people on the demonstrations. So, if you assume, let's say, people there on March the 26th, there's at least the same again who feel the same way but weren't there. So that's quite a lot of people. Of course, there's also, we know again from surveys, a fairly hard-line racist minority of kind of 15%, something like that, in this country, who are pretty, anti-immigration, hard-line, don't like black or Asian people at all. They're not just kind of, they just don't like them. So you've got those two things going on. I think what's happening in Europe at the moment is that one of the side effects of the breakup of the euro is this incredible racism which is coming out, not as we normally think of it about Muslims or black people or so on, but I mean the whole kind of national stereotypes are going absolutely haywire again. I mean, the French press described Angela Merkel as like Bismarck. Now, who the hell? They must have to educate all their readers to know who Bismarck is. The Greeks feel extremely resentful to the Germans for a whole number of reasons, that they're absolutely screwing their economy. But one of the things somebody was saying to me, that the Greek, even quite left-wing of the older Greek people, are saying, look, in the Second World War, we had to fight Mussolini, we then had to fight the Nazis, we then had to fight the British in the Civil War after the Second World War ended. And the Germans never paid their reparations. And now they're coming along and telling us all this. Now you can see where this is going. It's going to extremely nasty racial stereotypes of the sort that we're totally against. And right-wing parties will benefit from this. They will try and make the most of it. And the left has to be absolutely clear against all these things. Now, it's also true that most people don't like right-wing solutions. Most people are totally against fascism. In no country in Europe is fascism particularly strong in the way that you could have talked about it in the late 1920s. Even before Hitler came to power, he was 100 times stronger than any fascist organisation which exists in Europe at the moment. But of course you can see the potential there in 2 or 3 years, and therefore there's a battle between left and right, and there's a battle as to the outcome of the crisis. I think it was Joe who said about that actually the Great Depression, and the way out of the Great Depression was war, was rearmament and war. It wasn't there wasn't a kind of nice sunlit path, and that's what they were prepared to do. The ruling classes of Europe preferred war and preferred fascism than communism. I mean, that's a fact. That's what they were preferred to happen. So you have a very serious situation here, and we have to get our act together. Now that isn't going to happen just by sort of people just coming together. It means we've got to think of ways where the left can point the way to people getting an answer to the crisis. And I mean the point that Donald made, you see, I don't quite agree with you about Egypt. I think bourgeois democracy is one of the most important issues of our time, actually. And in a way, we've gone back to the sort of big 19th century struggles over bourgeois democracy, because in Egypt they're saying quite rightly, well, why can't we have a vote? Why can't we have the same democracy as they have in Britain? Now, we know the democracy in Britain is absolute, is not democracy as you might want it, but that's not true for these people. So I think defending bourgeois democracy and fighting to extend bourgeois democracy is one of the biggest struggles that we're going to face. And I have to say, in Egypt, I don't think the trade unions are the people actually leading the thing. I think the people leading the thing are the people who are challenging the state in Tahrir Square, and the trade unions are coming in support of them. But I think that's the cutting edge, because that is a political fight. It's not just about one particular trade union, it's a political fight against the whole state, which is so important. So I think these things are now facing us, and we have to find ways. We have to find ways of fighting against police repression. We have to fight for genuine democracy, and we have to fight over these issues of who pays for the crisis? And this, I don't think we should be complacent about this. You see, I thought the strikes were very, very good, but they were less than 10% of the workforce. Not everybody in the striking unions came out on strike. I know that from my own workplace, that quite a few people going to work because people are frightened. People are frightened. Lots of them are on temporary contracts or fixed term contracts, and they're worried. And this is what unemployment does. It makes people angry, but it also frightens people. So there's a big job to be done here, I think, to build the confidence. And I think socialists are absolutely key to that. And just to conclude, when you talked about the walks round Canary Wharf, I've just finished writing or co-writing a book on people's history of London, which, is fascinating. Well, I don't know if the book's fascinating, but the stories are fascinating, but you have to judge that for yourself. But you look at the periods where you have depression and where you have people living in much worse conditions even than people are living today, where people do organise and do begin to fight back. And this happened in the East End, particularly from 1888 with the match girl strike, and then the dockers strike and the gas workers and all these different people created a whole new politics in Britain, one which we're still living with. The period before the First World War, again, you had a general strike in London with the dock strike in the summer of 1911. Absolutely everything. They couldn't produce newspapers, they couldn't move food, they couldn't do anything at all. And we will see these things again, but then, it's a question of whether there's groups of socialists organised in order to try to assemble the most conscious section of the working class in order to change things.
Fine. Yeah, a few sort of specific questions. The credit rating agencies. There's sort of three big ones really: Standard & Poor's, S&P, Moody's, and Fitch's, and they're private institutions that are paid principally by large companies, but potentially by other people, to assess the creditworthiness of things like corporations and nation states. The reason they get paid to do this is if you're making a loan to a corporation, if you're going to lend some money in the form of a bond or whatever to IBM or something, you want to know how likely they are to default on it. And the same goes for a country. Like, you want to know whether you're going to get your money back again. And the credit rating agencies are supposed to sit there and provide an objective assessment of how likely it is that something's going to default, that you will or will not get your money back. Now, they've been hugely criticised in recent years. There's a specific thing is the role they played during the financial crash in 2007-2008, which is a lot of these new sort of financial products that the banks were starting to generate, so things like collateralized debt obligations and things like more synthetic collateralized debt obligations, increasingly complex and opaque and basically not very well understood ways of trying to carve up debt and credit and mix it all around and use a load of seemingly sophisticated maths and stats to make all this look like a nice safe product. It was credit rating agencies who'd supply the AAA ratings needed for these things to then go and be traded. AAA rating being, this is the safest thing that can exist. This is just absolutely no way someone who has a AAA rating is going to default. So, the US government, for instance, would have had one. Historically, Britain still has AAA rating. And so they'd say that these ludicrous new products that were completely flawed, that no one knew by this point what was going into them, that consisted of a mix of kind of very, very safe US government debt mashed up with very, very risky subprime mortgages, all turned into a nice, neat package. Credit rating agencies who were being paid by the banks that were creating these things would just turn around and say, oh yes, it's all perfectly safe. And so everybody else goes off and buys the things, and they sit with these ridiculous products on their books, and then when the crash comes, everything collapses. And obviously the credit rating agencies came in for a lot of criticism because the suggestion is that they're just providing ratings based on what people want to hear, not based on what's actually going on. Criticism this time round, by the way, is something quite different. I think it's perfectly reasonable. If you're just going to step back and say, well, is there a risk that France might be forced into default? Has it increased over the last few months or last year or so? Yes, it has. So the criticism this time round is, why on earth are you, Standard & Poor, downgrading these ratings when actually the entire European financial system, the entire European state system is in a completely reasonable state? They're quite a peculiar institution, but they're more
something that appears after the event than something that's driving events, because they're just there to report, and they're paid by different people, and they'll often try and say what people want to hear, but they may or may not do that at any given point in time. I don't think, although people sometimes get quite cross about the whole business, you'll notice that the people getting cross about it, by the way, people with an entirely vested interest in getting cross about this. So these people like Sarkozy and European leaders doing this, they're not necessarily a focus for where we should be looking for, like, the specific parts of the system that need criticising. I don't think so anyway. The issue on profitability, yes, that's right, profitability. Profits have gone up, reported profits have gone up, particularly for large corporations inside America and inside the UK over the last year, and gone up fairly substantially. That's the reported profits. That's what they'll tell their shareholders that are getting. So a lot of this is subject to kind of accounting tricks and all sorts of stuff, and I suspect a lot of it is due to that. Some of it, of course, if you're talking about the UK and the US, is profits from finance, which means it's the bailout, basically, and the after effects of the bailout. So, you know, it's not actually making a real profit underneath there at all. Some of it, I suspect, is the fact that they've cut wages and laid off a load of workers, and that's just the immediate effect of that one. It's not very likely to last, because we're in this increasingly dire economic situation, and there's no real reason. You can spend some time squeezing workers, but eventually the effect that no one has any money to buy the stuff you're trying to sell starts to kick in, and that wipes out your profits once more. So it's unlikely to last, and it's also very noticeable, because your other point was correct, that there is something like an investment strike taking place. Capital spending, investment out of retained earnings, out of the money that companies keep for themselves, is, as a proportion of that, it's the lowest since records began in Britain at the moment. Basically, large businesses in particular, big capital, is just not spending at all. So, which is, by the way, driving unemployment. If the people aren't spending on investment, the rest of it, of course, unemployment goes up. It's one of the things driving recession. The reason they're not spending is because they're absolutely terrified. They're all over the place, and it's quite dramatic on the level of personal wealth as well. The OECD figures that came out the other day, that Britain has the fastest increase in inequality and the fastest rises in wealth for the top 1% of society out of any developed country. I think that's pretty much the case. Over the last few years, that's accelerating as a recession happens, and the people are hoarding this wealth. They're not doing anything with it greatly, they're not sort of investing it, they're squirreling it away into things that look safe, and then trying to sit on that. Large companies doing exactly the same thing. It's one of the mechanisms driving the crisis at the moment, because there is an incredible fear amongst our ruling class that if they invest in anything that might create jobs, it'll be wiped out because the recession's so bad. They can't risk doing this. They can't risk against the future in that way. So that's one part of it. The final bit was on the epochal change in capitalism. Well, it's a sort of, this is where things get a bit complicated. Yes, I think we're absolutely at a situation where what were the dominant parts of capitalism, the lack of dynamism, the lack of growth, the lack of productivity growth that has been masked to some extent for the last 20 years by this huge increase in debt across the old developed parts of capitalism, North America, Western Europe in particular, now with Eastern Europe sort of tagging along, that's been masked. The underlying problems that capitalism has faced in those parts of the world have been masked by debt. That debt is now essentially due, and therefore all the problems have been brought out very dramatically, and the side effect of that is that areas of the world that have not suffered that kind of lack of dynamism in the same way, China outstanding amongst them, but also throwing maybe Brazil, for instance, are suddenly accelerating relative to the other sort of major old powers there. So that's kind of the effect that's going on. Now, of course, that is starting to die out. I did dig out the Financial Times here, which is the headline: Brazil's growth shudders to a halt. To a halt. So the latest figures there is that there's recession there now. In China, it's a bit more complicated because figures are kind of all over the place, and there's lots and lots of other things happening. But the exports, the effect that there's a massive recession in the places where it tries to sell stuff into, it's immediately starting to feed back. Interestingly also, Brazil sells a lot of raw materials to China, so any impact on China over there feeds back into Brazil over here. So even the bits of the world economy that were looking quite solid, certainly through the last recession, the financial crisis, 2007-2008, relatively China and Brazil and that lot, relatively easy time of it, if you just look at the figures. They're already starting to I think, see some impact, and because it's determined by the lack of dynamism at the centre of the economy, which is still the developed world, which is still North America and Europe, it's unlikely that they'll be able to recover anytime soon because of that. So the final bit is like, well, what do you do about it? The first one is I don't think they'll try and cobble together some deal on Friday in Europe, which is the epicentre of the crisis still. It's extremely unlikely that it's going to work. My guess is because the situation is so serious, it will probably last a bit longer than the last one did, because it's kind of, this is endgame for the euro. This is the collapse of major chunks of what all the different national capitalisms inside Europe thought they were doing for the last 50 odd years now. If you go right back to the Treaty of Rome, that will compel a certain amount of activity and a certain amount of efforts to overcome the problem. But the critical bit now, I think, is that they've made it absolutely clear that they are not going to force bondholders, the people who own the banks, they're not going to force them to take the hit from defaults, which means they're not going to allow defaults to happen inside Europe. And until you start to clear out some of the debt, there is no real hope of recovery for capitalism inside Europe. I mean, that's the case. And the flip side of it is that you'll probably end up with the defaults anyway, and therefore a financial crisis anyway. They're not touching finance, they're not doing anything about the crisis of debt directly. The obvious thing to do, even on capitalism's own terms, is to try and wipe away some of that debt and allow accumulation to proceed. Because they're not doing this, and because at the same time they're still coming with ridiculous schemes, leverage schemes to try and prop up and provide bailout funding for defaulting countries, it strikes me that this isn't going to work, and it's not going to work in fairly short order. That we'll be back to another crisis summit if the euro hasn't actually disintegrated by that point. We'll be back to another crisis summit within fairly short order. So in the midst of all that, I think the best thing to do is well, it's partly confidence, and partly what's happened with the Occupy Wall Street and the strikes last week, would overcome what might otherwise be a very bleak picture. But actually, I think the other thing here is that you have to argue for something like strategy. That there is a real need to say that we're not just sort of saying, well, the world is bad and people kind of agree with us. It's like, where do we go from here? What are the steps by which we do this? And one of the most important things, I think, still is what the coalition resistance has done in saying we need a united political opposition to austerity inside Britain in order to hold off the worst effects of it, just as a minimum condition of it. And that, I think, is one of the indicators out of the November the 30th strike, is that the possibility of building something like a coalition resistance really exists, and we ought to be the ones arguing for it, I think.
I'm just curious about Iceland. Nobody says anything.
Iceland, yeah, no one talks about it because it's broken the rules.
Well, what do you think? Are they clever, or are they going to be squashed?
I think they'll be fine. I think it's a country of 300,000 people. So I think they can quietly park Iceland. If people don't know about Iceland, basically the IMF turned up and said, you've run up this massive debt, you're all completely screwed, you have to pay back the debt. And people in Iceland said, well, we thought about this one and had a bit of a riot and decided we're not going to do that, thank you very much. and then actually what's happened is the IMF kind of left them alone. They sort of let them get on with this.
What if Italy did that, or Greece?
Yeah, well, you go from being a country of that's basically the size of Coventry to one that's kind of the size of Britain, right? So it's kind of a different scale.
That's slightly different, but Argentina also.
Yeah.
But the problem there, though, partly is the whole question of Europe, because once you've got European integration, then for any of them to do it inside Europe is much bigger. I mean, even when Slovakia had the temerity for its parliament to say 2 or 3 months ago that they were going to be against one particular bailout, everybody else went crazy. How dare these people, we let them in, and now look how they're treating us, and so on. And I mean, Italy is a huge economy compared to, but even so, it would then have a knock-on effect on all of them, which is why the real debate, I think, in Europe is either towards greater integration, which is really what the Germans are trying. The Germans are basically saying, we are going to run the show, and if people don't like it, they can leave, and, that's basically what they're saying. Or it will be a breakup of the whole thing. I mean, those are the two, seems to me, the two options.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thank you to James Lindsay speaking. Apologies to Donald for fudging your name.